We turn now to our third presenter, Chief Timothy J. Longo, Sr. Chief Longo is the Chief of Police of the city of Charlottesville, Virginia. He is entering his 34th year in law enforcement and is nationally recognized in the areas of police ethics and professional standards. He holds a law degree from the University of Baltimore, and from 1981 to 2000, he served on the Baltimore Police Force, where he commanded several divisions. Since 2001, he has served as Chief of Police for the city of Charlottesville. Chief Longo will address relational policing, a term he feels better describes the need for better police community engagement than the more familiar community policing. Chief Longo.
Mr. Marshall, I'm going to lower this mic a little bit here. I'm not quite as tall. Professor, thank you. I'm humbled to be in this wonderful building where so many others have come before me to speak on important national issues. For the past 34 years, and it seems like yesterday, quite frankly, I've had the great honor and privilege of serving as a police officer in this great nation. During that time period, I've watched this great profession of mine evolve. The evolution of policing in America has impacted strategies that reduce crime, maintain safe and healthy communities, and had the goal of improving relationships with those whom we are sworn to serve. One important aspect of this evolution that has profoundly impacted American policing is something we know as community policing. And within that concept, the notion of problem solving as to how police departments and their communities contribute to the development of positive, long-term relationships in a collaborative effort to identify solutions to the ongoing problems that communities face each and every day. Now, let me make one point pretty clear. Community policing isn't a contractual agreement. Contracts are instruments of distrust. The reason we have them is because your word's no longer good. See, community policing is a covenant. And from my perspective, it's about engaging police and citizens in a relationship that's aimed at addressing community needs and problems, reducing crime and the fear of crime, the implementation of long-term and sustainable strategies that will result in safer places to live, and an overall improvement in the quality of an individual's life and the lives of their families. Indeed, it has been a guiding force for American policing for decades. And unfortunately, the events that have occurred across our nation, particularly over the past year, have caused some Americans to question whether the underlying principles of community policing still matter. It's neither my purpose nor is it my intent to confirm or dispel whether the police have fallen short. Rather, I wish to underscore the importance of what I've branded relational policing and how it intersects with this broader concept of police legitimacy, a concept that has been at the forefront of policing for the past several years, and one that I believe is critical in restoring the public's trust and confidence. 21 years old, I walked the streets of West Baltimore. I patrolled the stairwells and the hallways and the courtyards of the George Murphy public housing projects and those of Lexington Terrace. And yet somehow I found a way to recognize the importance of engaging people, developing relationships and getting to know the people who lived where I came to work every day. For me, those relationships were as important as the technical skills I had been taught and the various tools that occupied my gun belt and the accessories that were in place in the cockpit of that police car, keeping in mind in 1984 there wasn't much in the cockpit of a police car. Community policing was real, and its benefits to me, even then, were obvious. And here we are many years later. I've come to believe that there has emerged an ever-growing fracture in the relationship between the police and the communities we serve. I say this not as a criticism aimed at either of the parties, but rather as a firm belief that the tragedies that have occurred across this nation that were the result from police and citizen interactions gone bad, the manner in which people reacted to those tragedies have threatened both the quality of relationship and the whole notion of police legitimacy. Now, support for my belief can be found in countless media accounts, civil rights claims, Department of Justice investigations which have resulted in memorandums of agreement and consent judgments that are aimed at reforming police policy, practice, training, supervision, and the investigation of both force and police misconduct. And further evidence can be found in my own experiences as a police practices expert and a trainer who works across this nation. It's in that regard that I'll share the following story. So a few years ago, I had occasion to be reviewing an image that was extracted from a dash cam taken from a police car. And the reason I was reviewing this image was a plaintiff's attorney had asked me to review and comment on whether I believe the actions of a police officer who used deadly force against another, whether those actions were contrary to generally accepted policing practices. And as I watched that police officer fire his or her weapon, what happened immediately thereafter was amazing to me. In a matter of minutes, large numbers of people advanced towards the outer perimeter that had been established by the police to protect that crime scene. And within minutes after that, those large group were in the hundreds. And they were becoming threatening to the police that were on the scene of that incident, and frankly, perhaps to each other. And it got me asking myself the question whether what I was observing in the way of reaction was less about that terrible tragedy that had just taken place, but more about the absence of legitimacy and the fracture in police-community relations that had taken place in that community and perhaps in that broader city. As America watched civil disobedience and violence unfold in Ferguson, Missouri last fall, I once again found myself asking the question of when and under what circumstances did the relationship between the police and the people of that community begin to deteriorate? When did the fracture take place? How? And really importantly, why wasn't it detected by the people who had the authority and the obligation to mend it so the trust and communication and relationship would not diminish into non-existence? Now, undoubtedly, Ferguson's just one example of what can happen when division occurs between the police and their constituents. But it's an example that played out not only in Ferguson, but in other communities across America that too began to feel the consequences of what occurs when police and community relations become fractured. Not a single day during those destructive days passed that a citizen in my own community didn't come up to me in church or in the grocery store or the gym or the downtown pedestrian mall or in a community forum and say, "Chief, could what happened there happen here?" I would always tell them that's the wrong question. The question is, would you let it happen here? And I suppose the answer to that question has more to do with the quality of relationship that we experience in my community. The question is, how do we get to restoration? And how can that restoration and those relationships be sustained? This past May, our president introduced their report on the 21st Century Policing Initiative. They published their findings and their recommendations, which were largely prompted by the events of Ferguson, Missouri. And while those events may have served as a contributing force behind the work of the task force, I also believe that the need to heal broken relationships between citizens and the police that have emerged over time really served as the catalyst behind the efforts of that task force. I don't believe it does much good to place blame on the circumstances that led to unrest. But I do believe it's important that law enforcement leaders, people such as myself, recommit to examining policies and practices that impact the manner in which we go about our work in order to improve the quality of police-community relationships, while at the same time not jeopardizing the safety of our community. To that end, each and every policy, practice, and operational strategy must be examined, and a determination must be made as to how those policies and practices impact our ability to create and sustain a safe community, and at the same time keep the elements of communication, trust, and transparency intact. Now, in an effort to illustrate how a particular policing strategy may have an unintended consequence and create mistrust within a community without serving any real value to public safety, I offer the following only, let me stress, only as an example. From time to time, police officers have consensual encounters with citizens that do not trigger constitutional protections. Some of these encounters may be instrumental in confirming or dispelling a suspicion of crime, the facts of which may fall below the legal standards of reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And during the course of these encounters, officers may seek and oftentimes receive permission to conduct searches of citizens and their property. Sometimes those searches result in the recovery of evidence or contraband. Yet oftentimes, these intrusions result in nothing, and the interaction ends with a citizen questioning whether the system worked fairly, whether they were treated fairly by the police during that transaction. Now, not only does the strategy I've described yield a very small return on investment, and even then rarely, it may well have the effect of alienating members of the community whose trust we are so desperately seeking to regain. Let me be clear. I'm not calling into question the legalities of such a practice. That's not my place. That's within the province of the court. Nor am I advocating that law enforcement agencies abandon strategies that are constitutionally permissible. I am, however, suggesting that we begin to view the Constitution as the floor and not the ceiling as we review these practices. While a policing strategy may be constitutionally permissible, it may not be the most productive strategy to deploy when you balance it against the needs and expectations of the community, particularly when the relationship between the police and the community is troubled. The idea of building trust is necessary to restoring life to community policing, to relational policing. Restoring trust where it's diminished or even disappears requires a commitment to examine the manner in which policing services are provided to a community. Evaluating existing policies and policing strategies against evidence-based practices, coupled with the collection and examination of relevant data, are important first steps in achieving what is envisioned by the 21st Century Police Task Force report. Yet both require fiscal and human capacity that is complemented by both robust data systems and the technical assistance and expertise to examine those practices and to interpret that data. The President's Task Force report and the recommendations, I believe, provide a substantive roadmap as we move forward in an effort to make procedural justice part of each and every practice we undertake, while at the same time taking steps to restore legitimacy in the communities that we serve. It will be the obligation, no question, it will be the obligation of our next president to affirmatively assist law enforcement leadership in implementing the recommendations set out in that report. This requires a commitment that both encompasses funding and technical assistance in the area of policy development, data analysis, and training. It also requires a commitment to adequately staff and to fund within the federal government those agencies that can provide resources to local law enforcement in the evaluation and the adoption of best practices. I previously referenced the Department of Justice in my comments, and specifically their role in police reform in America today. A brief history as to how that role is to develop may be helpful in understanding the complexity of reform and the resources that are required to bring about that kind of change. In addition to state law claims and federal statutes to provide remedies for police misconduct, Section 14141 of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 provided authorization to the Attorney General of the United States to bring a civil action against a municipality and its police department to obtain appropriate, equitable, and declaratory relief to eliminate a pattern and practice of unconstitutional conduct. The United States Department of Justice has entered into consent decrees and memorandums of agreement with a host of police agencies and municipalities across this country. These agreements have either resulted because of litigation or due to a pattern and practice or custom of unconstitutional conduct on the part of that municipality, its police department, or the officers that serve both. Each of these agreements set out a number of terms and conditions that are monitored throughout the duration. Perhaps the most instructive aspects of these agreements focused on areas of policy and training and supervision and the investigation of misconduct and the use of force. All of these broad areas directly impact procedural justice and legitimacy and ultimately affect police and community relations. In a broad sense, the ultimate goal of these agreements is to provide for the expeditious implementation of remedial measures to promote the use of the best available practices and procedures for police management and to resolve the United States claims against those municipalities and departments without resorting to adversarial litigation. So there's a practical reason why they exist. But I believe the elements of these collaborative agreements, coupled with the substantive roadmap provided by the President's Task Force report, are invaluable to bring about reform that is necessary to heal the fractured relationships and to restore public trust and legitimacy in communities where it's been lost. There are several federal agencies that have the ability to assist local law enforcement with the technical assistance that's necessary to replicate those best practices. And perhaps the most obvious resources within the Department of Justice, a resource I might add that's played and will continue to play an important role in assisting local law enforcement, is the Office of Community-Oriented Policing. Since its creation under President Clinton, the COPS Office has been a critical partner that has provided local law enforcement with both the funding and the technical assistance necessary to carry out important law enforcement initiatives that are aimed at both ensuring safe communities and building stronger police and community relations. In my opinion, there's never been a time when the expertise of the COPS Office has been so greatly needed at a local level. Therefore, it is critical that the next president ensure that their capacity exists and the funding exists within that important Department of Justice resource so that local law enforcement agencies has the assistance it needs to implement the substantive roadmap. But in addition to the traditional role of the COPS Office, there is an organization within it that is also an invaluable resource to local law enforcement, the Department of Justice Community Relations Section. The section was established pursuant to Title 42 of the United States Code, Section 2000 G1. The service provided by this very small group of people, I might add, this very small cadre of community relations specialists, has been invaluable to communities and police departments, both in the aftermath of events such as we saw in Baltimore and Ferguson. The skills and the technical assistance provided by this service is of tremendous value to local law enforcement and community leaders, and has been instrumental in bringing parties who are at odds together with a goal of restoring order and relationship and fostering a collaborative spirit aimed towards long-term, positive, and sustainable police and community relationships. Thus, it's imperative that this important asset to both local law enforcement and to our community have the appropriate capacity to adequately assist police departments in developing strategies around building trust and legitimacy, as well as assist in the implementation of those strategies and ultimately to measure the outcomes. Now, this raises an important question for our next president, who will inherit both the substance and the spirit of the work that was undertaken by the 21st Century Police Task Force. And the question is this: what commitment will be made, what substantive commitment will be made to ensure that the federal agencies tasked with providing technical assistance, funding, and logistical support will have the capacity to deliver those services in order that they may implement, the police agencies in these localities, may implement the important pillars set out in that task force report? Here's the short version of that pretty simple question. will those recommendations remain a national priority? And will that priority be supported at the highest position of this federal government? The effectiveness of a police agency is oftentimes measured not only by the quality of the people who are recruited into our ranks, but by the quality of the training and the education those officers receive. Much emphasis has been placed on training officers in areas such as enhanced communication skills, to include, among other things, verbal skills aimed at de-escalating situations that may arise on the street and oftentimes result in the use of force, and sometimes the use of deadly force. In addition to enhanced communication skills, there has been a focus on training that pertains to impartial policing, bias awareness, situational decision-making, and the appropriate use of force. Having served in municipal policing for almost 34 years, 20 of which have been in the command level, I can attest to the fact that during times of fiscal crisis, training budgets are often compromised so that we can meet emergent operational needs. To ensure that the task force recommendations, particularly those that involve training, are fully implemented, adequate funding must be available to localities to ensure that they obtain the best possible training in areas such as impartial policing, implicit bias, effective communication skills, and the reasonable and appropriate application of force. In years past, the COPS offices who I've previously mentioned, along with other federal partners, have made available funds to support such important training initiatives. In order to ensure that the recommendations of the task force take root in agencies nationwide, and that the principles behind those recommendations are embedded in police culture, assets must be in place and easily accessible to localities to support what I believe is a very important initiative. These assets include, but certainly aren't limited to, adequate funding to support not just the cost of such training, but the standardized curriculum that is based on evidence-based practices. Both the vision and the mission of a police agency is articulated through the manner in which officers go about their work. That work is first and foremost guided by the Constitution of the United States of America, the cases that interpret its meaning, and applicable laws. However, an officer's work is also guided by departmental policy and oversight. Policies are the mechanism by which an officer knows how to do their job. It's not enough that a police agency have comprehensive and responsive policies to guide a police officer's work. There must be mechanisms in place to ensure that those policies are being administered in a fair and impartial manner. When those policies are set aside, when they're ignored, when they're not supervised, or they're otherwise compromised, constitutional patterns and practices begin to evolve, and police legitimacy is threatened. The mechanism that is typically administered to ensure compliance with those policies is this concept we all know as supervision. In fact, supervision is the most practical and immediate of all management tools to determine whether policies and practices of an organization are being administered in a manner that is fair, impartial, and consistent with law. Therefore, it's critical that first-line supervisors have adequate training as well and are able to access resources in order that they can properly perform their duties to ensure that officers under their watch are honoring the promise and the commitment they've made to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. An important technology-based resources that can help supervisors in that particular task is something we call an early intervention system. Since the early 1980s, many large police agencies across America have implemented such a system. However, if all the system does is track data without analysis or action, it cannot be effective at preventing future misconduct and ensuring departmental policies and practices are being carried out in accordance with our law, but also the expectations of the community. Many of the settlement agreements previously mentioned include requirements concerning the collection of data related to high-risk critical tasks. Oftentimes, this data is captured within this early intervention system, but oftentimes other forms of records management systems. The collection and the analysis of this important data can be useful to not only police supervisors, but also policymakers. Now, while systems Processes and strategies are all necessary elements to reform policing in America. People will remain our greatest asset. They always have been and they always will be our greatest asset. It is the police officer on the street interacting with those who they serve, building trust, breaking down barriers to communication, and collaboratively figuring out the best way in which to make neighborhoods safer so that the broader communities they serve become healthier places to live, work, and visit. Not so long ago, I invited retired Raleigh-Durham Police Chief Harry Dolan to speak to several of my officers about the importance of communication in the way they interact with the community that we serve. And during his visit, the chief had occasion to have dinner with one of my young sergeants, a sergeant who's committed his life to public service. In the midst of their talk at dinner, Harry said something to this young man that caught him by surprise, but forever changed the way he'll think about his future and the future of his profession. Bobby, he said, we've never been stronger as a profession. You know, the challenges facing cities across America, the fractured relationships between police and citizen, and the focused attempts to reform the manner in which we go about our important work present tremendous opportunities for our officers and our communities. That's what I think Harry meant when he said, Bobby, we've never been stronger as a profession. You see, what one may characterize as conflict has the potential of leading us to restoration. Restoration of trust, confidence, of hope, but ultimately relationship. Firmly rooted within a plan for such restoration is the reality that relationships are, in fact, the very essence of community policing and the most necessary of the components to make the 21st century task force recommendations a reality that will make communities safer and forge a greater, long-term, and more sustainable relationship between the police and the communities they serve. Thank you so much for your time.
Chief Longo, thank you so much for an outstanding presentation on the importance of community policing. Are there any questions for the chief?
Thank you, Chief. You spoke a lot about the need for relational community policing. You also spoke about the need for training. I'm wondering if you could, and you started to address this, but if you could elaborate more on, do we have enough knowledge about how we should reward and promote good police practices that promote community policing? Because the incentive structure that's created ultimately, I would think, would have an effect on the behavior of police officers. And is that something that the federal government, the cop shop, and other parts of the federal government could do more of in terms of its research and analysis on how better to do it?
I think the various federal partners, Bureau of Justice Assistance comes to mind as one, certainly the COPS office is another, you know. In American policing, our measuring stick, how we measured outcomes for many years were around things like how many people we arrested, how many cars we stopped, how many calls for service we responded to, and that was kind of how your work was measured. Well, those days are gone. How we measure the quality of the interaction with the community, with the person on the street, has to be part of the equation that we evaluate ourselves against. And that's complicated because it's a shift in the paradigm, it's a shift in the way we think, but it's a shift that's absolutely necessary as we evaluate patterns and practices and policies and procedures and the way we supervise and evaluate performance. So certainly, looking at what those best strategies are to award officers, to communicate the message to police officers that you made the right decision. Tomorrow night, I'll be heading home and I'll be hosting an annual awards and recognition banquet for our police officers. And several years ago, a foundation board member who's also a professor at our law school at the University of Virginia came up to me and she said, "Do you realize what you're doing? Do you realize the whole point of this event?" And I said, I don't know what you mean. She said, "What you're rewarding aren't just acts of heroism. You're rewarding good decisions. You're rewarding police officers that are out there engaging people and building strong relationships in the community that you serve." But we got a long way to go in that regard. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions? If Not, thank you very much.
Thank